Welcome. In this screencast, you will learn about the development of the sound system, and there you will learn both about production and perception of speech sounds. Before we start with the actual topic, let's review different situations that can lead to bilingualism in the classroom. One situation is that children acquire a heritage language at home and the societal language outside of the home. Another situation is that children acquire 2 or more languages in a multilingual society. And the third situation is that monolingual and bilingual children learn a foreign language in school. So there are even children who only learn one language in the first years of life, then are acquiring a second one. In the screencast, we will focus on this third group here. If we now come back to the topic, so the sound system, or the L2 sound system, is part of the second language phonology. So the different speech sounds, both the phonemes and the allophones, are part of this segmental level. So this is really about the individual sounds. And then, of course, there is also this other level that has more to do with things like speech melody, rhythm, stress, and so on. And both of these aspects are very important for both production and perception of speech, also in this second language context. And we will focus on phonemes and allophones today, so on the speech sounds, and not so much on the suprasegmental. And research has also mostly focused on the segmental aspects so far. So we will now start with talking about the perception of speech sounds. And to understand this better, you need to have a bit of understanding how this works in babies. So before the fetus is even born, he or she can already perceive the prosody of the language that is spoken around them. And also at birth, newborns can already distinguish their L1, so their first language, from other languages, and they can also identify their mother's voice. So even at birth, these newborns are very skilled already in speech perception. And newborns can also distinguish all speech sounds from any language. So this also makes sense in the way that newborns are ready to acquire whatever language is, or languages that are spoken around them. So no matter where they are born in the world, they can distinguish the speech sounds, and they have not tuned in their speech perception abilities to a particular language yet. So at this point, they can distinguish all of them, and you also see that here in the on the graph on the right. So at the age from 6 to 8 months here in this group, both the Japanese and the American infants perform similarly on these English contrast. So at this point, at this early age, the infants have not tuned into their one or several languages yet. At this point, they all perform really well on all of these speech sounds. When babies are approximately 1 year old, they have already started to specialize in the contrastive sound of the languages or language in their environment. So sounds that are important to distinguish words, they can identify. So for example, in English, you can have an example like read and lead. So the r and the l sound distinguish meaning. So in English, these are contrastive sounds. So babies that grow up learning English, approximately at this age, they have started to specialize more in these sounds, and they can tell that these are relevant in their L1. But specializing in this one language or these languages in the environment also comes at a cost. So by this age of 1 year, babies are not as good as they were before at distinguishing sounds that are not contrastive in their languages. And you see that here in the graph again. So around this first birthday, the American infants have become really good at this contrast, and that Japanese infants are not so good at this contrast anymore, because both of those groups have specialized more in the contrastive sounds of their respective first languages. We know that speech perception is categorical, and that means that listeners can distinguish sounds well that fall into different categories in their language. So if there are two different sounds, one is something like a p sound and one like a b sound, and if in the L1 of a particular speaker, these are two different categories, then the person will be good at distinguishing them. But if we have two sounds that are within the p category, but have the same acoustic difference as the p-b contrast, then this is very difficult for the listener. So these speech category boundaries help us a lot in distinguishing the sounds, and these categories help us more than just the acoustic difference. And this is also what we see here on the right. So here the difference between the p and the b, so the voicing was manipulated. And at the boundary of these two categories, it was much easier for the participants to hear the difference between two sounds than when both of these sounds were in the p category or in the b category, even though the acoustic differences were the same. We will now take a look at an example of this categorical perception. And we first need to have a look at different approximants in American English and in Japanese. So you can see it here on this chart from the International Phonetic Alphabet. The orange circles show what the American English approximants are, and the blue circles show the Japanese ones. And you see that for American English, there are two more approximants. We saw how the approximants differ between Japanese and American English, and also in general, this is what we see with the phoneme inventories, that they differ between the languages, at least to some degree. So some phonemes are shared, others differ. And what we often see then is that several, in this case, two non-native phonemes are mapped onto one native phoneme, so one single category. And here the example is that the English R and L sounds that we saw only exist in English but not in Japanese are then mapped onto one Japanese category. And this can, for example, be a flap or a tap. And it's very difficult for Japanese speakers to acquire those sounds because they are mapped onto this single category, at least initially. And the difference between categories can be difficult to perceive for non-native speakers, depending on the similarity of the two phoneme inventories. So if there are some categories that are really close together, then this can actually also hinder the perception. The main message from the perception part was that children become really experts in the phoneme inventory of their language within the first year of life. So they know which sounds matter for their first language. And also we learned that speech perception is categorical, and that when you learn a second language, there is usually this mismatch between the different categories in the first stage of learning, where several categories from one language are mapped on just a single category in the other language. So now we're moving to production, and we'll start with an example with vowels. So here you see the vowel landscape from the International Phonetic Alphabet. And for Spanish, you see that there are relatively few vowels. So all the circles here represent a vowel in the respective language. And for American English, you can see that there are many different circles there. So when someone who has Spanish as their first language and English as their second language, when they start speaking English, they will usually choose the nearest vowel that they have in Spanish to replace the English vowel. So then also, contrastive sounds in English may be produced with the same vowel in Spanish. For consonants, we can observe similar patterns. So also there, it is common that consonants are replaced by other consonants. So for example, in German, obstruents at the end of a word. So for example, Hund, so the word for a dog, there we can only have deep voiced consonants, so the t sound, even though underlying there is the d sound. And this phonological rule is also then often applied to other languages. And then German speakers will then say in their English L2 something like back instead of bag, because they have this rule from German that a g sound can never stand at the end of a word. So at this segmental level, there is transfer from one language to the other, so that you take certain rules or a certain mapping from one language to the other. But you also have this at a more fine-grained level. So pairs of stop consonants like t and d and k and g, they only differ in voice onset time. So between t and d and k and g, that's the only difference. And voice onset time is the time between the release of the stop consonant and the start of the vibration of the vocal folds. And there are VOT differences between languages. So for example, a Dutch t and a German t differ in VOT. And it is also common that these voice onset times are also transferred from one language to the other. So someone who has Dutch as their first language will then most likely also produce a similar t with a similar voice onset time in German. And this can also lead to miscommunication if then other Germans interpret this as a d, for example. So this is also something to keep in mind, that the segments can be transferred from one language to the other, but also at this more fine-grained level. And there are several factors that play into the development of the sound system. So there is the effect of the phonological distance. So at least on average, it is easier to learn a language from the same language family. So for example, if you already know French, it is then easier to learn Spanish than to learn an unrelated language. So for example, French and Japanese. And there's also an effect of exposure. So high degree of exposure to the language can also reduce the accentedness. So if you use a certain language for many, many hours, for many years, then through exposure to the language, the accentedness can also be reduced. But of course, there's also something like language ability or aptitude that also plays a role. There's also the effect of age of acquisition, which is also linked to the sensitive period. And this says that an earlier age of acquisition makes it less likely that speakers will have a non-native accent than a later age of acquisition. So this is what we usually find from this phonological side. But there is still a small group of L2 learners with a late age of acquisition that do sound native-like. And this is often then due to high language aptitude, so that they are, so to say, born language learners, and also a high degree of exposure to the language. You have now heard about the theory and the research within this field. And I will try to relate this back to implications for teaching. So one of the first questions in this is then, what is the aim for the students? So is the aim that the students are intelligible, or is it that the students sound like a native speaker? So, I mean, there's this whole debate about the native speaker norm, or whether it's maybe more important that the students are intelligible because they will also interact a lot with other non-native speakers. And so this is, I guess, a question that will depend on the course. But yeah, students can also be very intelligible even though they do not sound like native speakers. And what research has shown is that both instruction on segmental and also on supra-segmental aspects help improve pronunciation. So also, if you focus more on like the melody of the language, the rhythm, the stress, and so on, this actually helps even more to improve the pronunciation of the students. And there is also a lot of individual differences in this regard. So students may struggle with different segments, and they then also may need different instructions. And what, based on research, what would also be recommended is to teach students about the phonological differences between their native language and the non-native language that they're learning. So we saw the examples here in this presentation with the Japanese versus English approximants. So these are R&L sounds. So raising awareness and then practicing this with different methods. And the same for production. We saw the example with the Spanish versus English vowels. Also, again, raise awareness and then practice this with different methodologies. And what I also want to point out here is that both perception and production are important here in terms of learning or improving the sound system. And there are also many different links between perception and production. So there are studies showing that if you improve in one of those areas, you also improve in the other one. So this can have a positive effect of both production and perception then. And then depending on the age of the students, if they are a bit older, it could also make sense to teach them the phonetic alphabet. So especially for languages that don't have this one-to-one mapping between letters and sounds like English, drawing more attention to the pronunciation can be supported by the phonetic alphabet. So if you see the examples here with though and through, this again shows how English is very opaque, how there is not this one-to-one mapping. So this can help students focus more on the pronunciation and not be so misguided by the letters that don't tell them so much about the pronunciation. Here we would like to thank the EU for funding this project. And if you want to learn more about this or related topic, you can go to this website.